Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the international implications of the U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza, and in particular, the drive for a new international order, which is something that is far from new, but I think we're actually seeing more momentum in response to these horrors that are being carried out. There's this, it's kind of a cliche, but there's a very prescient quote by Gramsci who wrote, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And then the latter part is often forgotten. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And there can be few symptoms more morbid than this genocide that is being carried out by the US and Israel in Palestine. Now, it's noteworthy that Gramsci said that in 1930 on the eve of the rise of fascism. And I think what's actually very interesting is to see some of the shifts in Latin America. Today, I'm going to be focusing a lot on the perspective of some left-wing Latin American leaders. But I think one of the most interesting developments in the past few years has been the first ever rise of a left-wing government in Colombia, of Gustavo Petro. And honestly, he has surpassed my expectations in how principled he's been on many international issues. Colombia, just a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, before Hugo Chavez's death in 2013, Chavez famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. Israel was the most loyal U.S. proxy in the region, dominated by right-wing oligarchic forces. Petro is the first ever left-wing president of Colombia. There had been left-wing candidates who were killed in the past. And on the issue of Palestine, he's been extremely principled and outspoken. And he's said this point that he's repeated many times, and I think it's actually very interesting. He refers to the time we're living in as a global 1933 with the return of fascism. And he has repeatedly warned in the past 2 years during this genocide that, quote, Gaza is just the first experiment to deem all of us disposable, end quote. And then he added, and he said, what we see in Palestine will also be the suffering of all of the peoples of the global south. And in particular, Petro, he has a Marxist background. He was in a revolutionary socialist armed group. They later signed a peace deal and put down their arms, but he never abandoned his left-wing, never abandoned the left-wing social movements that he's been part of. And he is also an environmentalist and focuses in particular on the effects of climate change. But of course, you could also just to understand this more broadly with the decline of capitalism. He focuses on how we're in a climate crisis and the West continues on defending its lifestyle of excessive consumption, which is predicated on the super exploitation of the global South. And as he put it, the global North, the imperialist countries, are willing to commit genocide and kill and abuse and terrorize the peoples of the global South. As the climate breaks down, there will be more migration, more crises. We see this with the abuse of immigrants in the United States. And his argument is that what is being done to the Palestinian people is what the imperial core plans on doing more generally to the global South. And I would say this is not just an issue of climate breakdown. This is an issue of capitalist crisis. We've seen across the global North severe declines in living standards, an increase in poverty. Life expectancies in the U.S. for the younger generation for the first time are lower than those of their parents and grandparents. Clearly, capitalism is in severe crisis. And this is at a time when the Western countries can no longer resort to the super exploitation of the colonies that they had, the formal colonies that they had. And they're returning to this kind of 19th century style, more blatant imperialism. And we see this in Palestine. Lula, I started with them because, of course, always Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which have revolutionary socialist governments, have always been the most principled and the most anti-imperialist. But we even see on the issue of Palestine that the more social democratic oriented, more progressive, not as radical governments in Latin America have also been very outspoken on Palestine, and it represents an important shift in this region. These leaders have been very outspoken against Israel and the United States. This is from the speech that Lula, the president of Brazil, gave at the United Nations this September, the UN General Assembly General Debate. And he said, nothing justifies the ongoing genocide in Gaza. international law and the myth of the ethical exceptionalism of the West are also buried there under the rubble with the Palestinians. And we've seen a massive shift in global opinion in the past 2 years. This is just looking at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And it's noteworthy that, one, this poll was conducted before the return of Donald Trump. We've seen even more of a shift against the U.S. since the return of Trump. This is, when Biden was president and the U.S. pretended to care about multilateralism. It was obviously cynical propaganda. But what's also the other point that's noteworthy about this poll is if you look at the countries with large Muslim populations, especially Indonesia, the most populous Muslim majority country on earth, but also Malaysia, there's been a massive shift of public opinion away from the US and toward China. And this poll also, this doesn't mean that the people in all these countries are extremely anti-China. This is if they were only forced to pick one country, which is not realistic. What we're actually seeing is that more and more countries have taken a non-aligned position, and the genocide in Gaza has only reinforced the importance of these countries pursuing a different path. They can see the true face of US-led imperialism. We saw another clear example of this, how public opinion has moved sharply against the US and Israel. When Netanyahu delivered his speech at the General Assembly in September, there was the largest walkout I have ever seen. I mean, walkouts are not very common at the General Assembly, but when there are walkouts, I've never seen one this big. There was also another walkout against Netanyahu last year, but Netanyahu was speaking basically to an empty room. Dozens of countries, their representatives walked out in protest. Again, this just illustrates how isolated Israel is in the international stage. And I think the United Nations this year was actually this is all related to what's happening, this genocide in Gaza, which is really the breakdown of the US-led imperialist order. And we really see two competing visions that were articulated by the speeches given by Trump and by China's premier, Li Qiang, this year at the UN General Assembly. The United States so clearly, if you listen to Trump's speech, is saying that we don't care about multilateralism. We don't care about these international institutions. The U.S. only cares about this idea of America first, just blatant, bald-faced imperialism, threatening war on Venezuela, carrying out genocide in Gaza, attacking Iran, threatening to colonize Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal and Gaza. The plan is to colonize Gaza so Trump can build luxury real estate. And maybe in the short term, it will be run by this colonial committee run ostensibly led by, the butcher of Iraq, Tony Blair. So that's one vision of trying to destroy all international institutions to try to save U.S. unipolarity on one side. But also, I think the speech given by China's premier, the second in command, Li Qiang, was very interesting. He emphasized the importance of reforming global governance institutions. I mean, I'll briefly talk about this toward the end. China has launched the Global Governance Initiative, and this is taken very seriously in Beijing. This is not just a talk shop. They understand that this is a moment in which it is extremely important, it is urgent to reform these international institutions so they can actually be platforms for the global South, not just neo-colonial institutions that are dominated by the West. And we also saw this in the way, this is not new, but the U.S. has completely weaponized every aspect of the international institutions that exist, including the financial system through the weaponization of the dollar and the use of sanctions and tariffs. Tariffs are really the weaponization of access to the U.S. market, just as sanctions are the weaponization of the dollar system. And we've also seen the U.S. weaponize the UN system, and the fact that the U.S. tragically is the headquarters of the UN are in New York City, and the U.S. has prevented Palestinians from attending UN meetings. So once again, showing how the U.S. is this complete rogue state. And you can see this so clearly reflected in the votes at the United Nations, where last year there was a vote on admitting Palestine as a full member state, and it was 75% of the world against the U.S. and a few proxies, 9 against 143. And what's interesting is also to note how even some European countries, have been breaking with the US on this particular issue. These are contradictions that are emerging even within the imperialist alliance. And what's striking is, you look at these maps of these votes. It's the same vote you see again and again, although with a few more European exceptions, but it is the US-led West against the rest of the world. This is a vote in 2023 condemning unilateral sanctions, the West against the rest of the world. This is a vote on a call for reaffirming the call for a new international economic order. Last year, 2024, was the 50th anniversary of the original call for the new international economic order, and the 50th anniversary of the founding of the G77. And so this is obviously not new. This has been the demand of the global South, the global majority, for many decades. But I really think that we actually are seeing in these moments, it has become so clear to the global majority that the current system cannot continue. There need to be fundamental changes, and the inability of the United Nations to stop the genocide in Gaza, with the US using its veto 6 times in 2 years in the Security Council, 4 times under Biden, and 2 times thus far under Trump in 8 months. 6 vetoes to continue a genocide. It has just become so clear to the entire world that we need a new system. And this is why I think when China is talking about this idea of a global governance initiative, this is not just a talk shop. These initiatives in Beijing are taken very seriously. And that's why I'll say that, there's been a big debate. We've talked about it many times. There's been a debate on the international left about BRICS and organizations. Yeah. There's been a big debate about organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And critics have argued that they're not doing enough. And certainly, there can be criticisms, but I think, these are organizations that follow the legacy of the non-aligned movement, and there needs to be fundamental change. And if there is going to be change to prevent these kinds of genocides from happening in the future, to actually support movements for national liberation, it's going to be through these organizations that are trying to build a more multipolar world. So this is why I conclude with the same slide that I began about. We are living in this interregnum that Gramsci observed in 1930. Now, what I hope is that it doesn't lead to World War II, which is what, of course, fascism ultimately led to. We're seeing very morbid symptoms indeed with the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza. But I think that this could be, as horrific and tragic as it is, this could be part of this very difficult process of a new world being born, where it becomes completely undeniable to the rest of the world that we cannot continue with the system as it exists of capitalism and imperialism, because it is a system predicated fundamentally on genocide. So on that, I'm going to conclude. I want to thank everyone for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the other interventions today.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.